Toronto. It's on the front page of some major international newspapers, but maybe not in the capacity the city would like. Joining us now to discuss Toronto's global reputation and whether it will recover from whatever damage may have been caused, in Studio City, California, Joel Kotkin, Distinguished Presidential Fellow at Chapman University in Orange, California. And our online producer, we should mention, Naveen Vaswani, is hosting a Twitter chat on this very topic right now, so chime in and give us your thoughts using the hashtag AgendaTVO. Joel, it's good to have you on the program again. How you doing from out there on the left coast?
Well, it's pretty nice, and I'm glad to be here.
Well, yeah, you are, I mean, to some respects, an honorary Canadian, because I think your wife's from Canada, but as an outsider to Toronto, what do you think, just off the top, what do you think of when you think Toronto?
Well, of course, you have different images. One is, of course, Toronto, the good and boring. That's the historic view, sort of the Mordecai Rickler view of Toronto. What I see it as is a city that certainly that has usurped the position of Montreal as Canada's great city. And I also think of it as being a very diverse city. And from my own experience and from research, a very spread out city, not very different than Montreal, much less concentrated, and really a very very diverse, not just in terms of ethnicities, but in how people live. Huge suburban percentage, even in the city, and overall in the region, and yet you have a growing and strong urban core as well.
Has that impression of Toronto, which you have held to date, changed since all of the issues around the Ford video come out?
Well, I can't comment on the video and who did what to whom. Ford's election itself was interesting in that it from what I understand, it represented a sort of revolt of the more suburban residential parts of Toronto against what might be thought of as the hegemony of the downtown establishment and the people who favor more high density living. And I think this is a conflict we're going to see a great deal more of. And I've really done a lot of thinking about it. And I think one of the answers is clearly to move away from the idea that cities should get larger in terms of jurisdiction and try to look to more decentralized. Because, when you think about Toronto, its residential neighborhoods, its high density neighborhoods, in a way, it's like a couple sleeping together and having different dreams.
Okay, I'm going to pursue that analogy and the larger point that you're trying to make in just a second, but I want to revisit, first of all, this notion of whether what's happening around the video and all of the attention Toronto is getting right now in a way that it never has before, whether that can have, in your view, a lasting negative impression on what people think of Ontario's capital city.
I don't think it will be a long-term impact. But I do think it is something that people have made me aware of there too, is as Toronto has become the undisputed financial and business capital and has become an enormous immigration magnet, that it also has begun to develop many of the problems that those of us who live in the United States and live in Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, have all experienced. That there is an underbelly of crime, certainly some very sleazy people, and I understand even in Toronto some gun violence and some drug-related crimes, obviously. And I think this is a change from the attitude that many Americans have had of Toronto as being clean and pure and safe. And maybe it will change that a little bit more towards, Toronto is a big city, and it has the great things of big cities and it has the bad parts.
So our days, as Peter Ustinov said, of being New York run by the Swiss are gone?
Yeah, I would think they may have been gone a long time ago. That very sort of, I'm going back to Mordecai Rickler, the descriptions of Toronto as kind of a very staid metropolis. I think, it's probably gone now. I mean, we haven't had so much excitement in Los Angeles, and, we're supposed to be sort of a culture leading city, and, you guys have got us beat.
Okay, let's go back to the point that you were trying to make earlier about really the dynamic of the city right now. You have the so-called downtown, midtown, if you like, elites, surrounded by these inner suburbs of, I guess what has come colloquially to be called Ford Nation, the people who overwhelmingly supported the incumbent in the mayor's office and allowed him to win. And I wonder how common that dynamic is in other big cities that you've looked at around North America.
Well, it's certainly common within cities that are very large and are large enough to have suburbs. Obviously, some cities don't have a lot of suburbs, but it's certainly been a big conflict. It's a big conflict historically here in Los Angeles, where we're right now in the San Fernando Valley, which is more suburban, more single-family houses, and its conflict with downtown LA. In New York, where I grew up, the conflict between Brooklyn and Queens, and particularly Staten Island, and sort of the Manhattan monolith, I think has been there. But on a regional basis, I think there's even more of a competition. You know, as people begin to push for more and more regional government and to have more things done over an entire region, then that conflict will become worse, because the suburbanites, who are generally the majority of a whole region, are usually outmaneuvered and outmediated by the people in the downtown core and outpoliticked. And so what you find is the bigger the government, the bigger the scope of the government, the bigger the geography of the government, the more the central core tends to impose its agenda on an ever larger area. And I would think the answer to that, to some extent, is more decentralization of government, even down to the neighborhood level. And also, I think, also to think about the idea that in those areas where there needs to be cooperation, let's say with an airport authority or a transit authority, that you have it on an ad hoc basis instead of trying to run everything through a political marriage that isn't going very well.
Okay, but having said that, one of the things we're trying to explore tonight is whether the values and the needs of the so-called downtown or midtown core differ significantly from those of the inner suburbs. And when I say the inner suburbs, I don't mean the regions surrounding Toronto. I mean what we used to in this part call
Right.
Scarborough, Etobicoke, North York, East York, York, that kind of thing. The boroughs. What do you think on that score?
Well, I think you'll find that there are huge differences. Probably not as much ethnic as people might think, because we know pretty well that immigrants in Canada, I just saw a recent study on that, as in the United States, will move to the suburbs basically as fast as their bank accounts will allow them to. But fundamentally, I think that there are differences. People who live in suburbs tend to be there for a longer period of time, may be more likely to be property owners, may be more likely to be small business proprietors. They probably would look a little more at peace and quiet, and those kind of things as being stability. You go to a suburban neighborhood for stability. The urban core is looking more for entertainment. It's more trying to compete with other urban cores in other parts of not only of Canada, but other parts of the world. So their search is for superlatives, or as Terry Nichols Clark at the University of Chicago has called it, they see the city as an entertainment machine, as some place where they get to experience things. Where for the suburbanites, it's more a place to live and maybe raise a family. And those are really two different dynamics. And cities are having a very hard time with this, because we look at suburban areas have considerably higher birth rates, many more people, families with children, as opposed to the inner core, which tends to have many more single people and many more childless couples. And childless couples and single people have somewhat different needs than people with children.
It feels, though, in this city of more than 2.5 million people, as if there is a real us versus them thing happening now. I'm not pretending that that's new. It's been that way for a long time. But I know you as a guy who thinks we ought to show proper respect to the suburbs. And I noticed in your Daily Beast piece, you called the inner city types the chattering classes. And I wonder whether you're sort of contributing to this us versus them phenomenon.
Well, what I really am trying to do is say it's been us versus them, but for the most part, them, if you call them the suburbs, have had almost no voice. I mean, what may be most interesting about Ford is that he gave voice to something that was inchoate. Suburbs are very, very bad at projecting themselves, of defending their interests. In part because people move to suburbs to be in a neighborhood, to be with their neighbors, to be at their church, to be with their friends, to be with their family. And they don't tend to be dominated by big property owners and well-organized institutions and interests. So in a sense, it's a kind of almost like a rebellion of a kind of, if you will, urban, not proletariat, maybe more a sort of a yeoman class, against a much more hierarchical group that includes a lot of poor people and a lot of wealthy people. I just think that we need to understand that these metropolitan areas need suburbs and they need core cities. And I think that when we try to impose one group's sort of value system on the other, you inevitably get conflicts.
Just tell us in our last 30 seconds then, Joel, is there a city in North America that you know of that balances nicely the needs and values of the inner city and the suburbs to, the relative satisfaction of the majority?
I would say the city of Houston, where Mayor Parker is, she's gay, she's, liberal on a lot of social issues, but very open to development in the suburbs, but also promoting the city. One of the things that really solves a lot of these problems is a sort of environment of growth. So I would say Houston is a city that has a very interesting and thriving downtown and flourishing and growing suburbs. I think you can have both. You need a different quality of leadership than what we usually see.
Gotcha. Joel, always good of you to join us on TVO. Thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure.
That's Joel Kotkin, Distinguished Presidential Fellow, Chapman University in Orange, California.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.